The Rebel Capitalist Show. What do you think about this idea? And I heard this from my good buddy Jeff Snyder, where when you had Deng Xiaoping in charge and the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991, how Snyder was saying that they, meaning the Chinese government, sent economists into Russia to figure out what went wrong. And their conclusion was not that communism is a complete failure, but their conclusion is that they didn't allow capitalism to run long enough or to really flourish long enough to where the revolutionaries could take over and implement their socialist utopia, according to the Marxist doctrine. And so the solution for China was just to continue to allow capitalism to run its course until you got to this point, which they call late stage capitalism. And when you do, then the government needs to take over the means of production, or else the capitalists will really feed on themselves and the whole system will implode. So when you look at what's happening through the lens of the new leader, Xi Jinping, and you see this authoritarian approach that he's been taking, especially over the last 2 years, do you think he is saying, okay, we're at this point of late stage capitalism, and now we need to start taking over the means of production and implementing this socialist utopia and workers' paradise? Or what do you think his rationale there is for being more draconian and kind of more socialist?
I think it's some of that. I mean, China has had a lot of central planning, but also if you were a foreigner, an entrepreneur, a small business owner, and in the early 2000s, you went there up until really like 2014, there was a pretty good amount of free markets and capitalism there. They wanted to make money.
Right.
Things changed a lot from speaking with people who lived in China, who are either still there or who moved in the last couple of years. Things changed a lot starting in 2014 when she consolidated power. So the rules started to rapidly change. They started to change before Trump. But Trump really accelerated this because then he became the scapegoat, especially once he put the tariffs on. And that brings me back to China's shadow banking, which is all based on real estate collateral. So a lot of these banks, and China's going to bail out the banks. Okay, they did this. They've done this in 2015 and 2016. There was enormous amounts of bank bailouts back then. A lot of them did not get out to the Western media. They were talked about in Fed minutes.
Jason, when you say banks, are you talking specifically about the banks that are run or owned by the government, or are you talking about all the community banks? I mean, there's a lot of banks in China that are not run by the government.
Okay, so China has started to nationalize. This started in 2019. They started to nationalize all the banks.
Okay.
So there was independent banks, you're correct. But in 2019, once Baoshan Bank, and that was the first one, and then you had Bank of Jinzhou, which was larger, and then you had other small and medium-sized banks, all within like 2 or 3 months, you had them fail. Did you see who bailed them out? The first bailout for Baoshan Bank, it was the People's Bank of China. The central bank bought a private bank. Okay, that was the first bailout.
Wow.
Then the bailouts got larger and more ridiculous, I would say. So at one point, and I did a video on this back in 2019, you had a $300 billion bailout of a Chinese bank, one of their state-owned enterprise banks, one of the largest banks in China. I have the article screenshot. I spent 10 hours on this China video in 2019, going through all the article titles of all the bank bailouts. They actually had one of the largest banks in China with trillions of dollars in assets. It bailed out an entire province. One of the largest provinces in China gave them $300 billion.
Wow. Okay.
So the bailouts also, there was another bailout where I can't remember if it was Bank of Jinzhou or another one around that size, where one of China's sovereign wealth funds, which has trillions of dollars in assets, they were ordered by the Chinese government to buy a private bank too. So that's the way it was papered over.
How big of a player is HSBC in mainland China? I know they're huge in Hong Kong, but how much mainland?
Very big, because of the Chinese real estate bubble, because the belief there is a real estate bubble in China, and it is perpetrated by the government, because in the major tier 1 cities in Shanghai and Beijing, the other tier 1 cities, that the Chinese government, I've heard this from multiple people, sources there, and there's documentaries out on this, the Chinese government actually monitors costs that people pay for square footage in those cities. And if the sale price is lower below a certain amount of government approved square footage, they cancel the sale. So they are manipulating prices to try to make sure they cancel sales, to try to make sure the prices go up. But you have tons of scams. There's a book that your listeners should really read. It's by Denny McMahon. He's an Australian. He moved to China. He lived there for over a decade. He speaks fluent Mandarin, and he went and interviewed Chinese bankers. He went and interviewed Chinese business people whose businesses 5 to 7 years ago failed. So these were factory owners, and all of a sudden their business in another industry, say either making toys or plastics or other cheap goods, and their business was either failing or unprofitable. They went to a Chinese bank, or they went into the China's shadow banking system, which is many trillions. They pledged their factory, which was unprofitable, as collateral, basically like a pawn shop. The bank accepted an unprofitable factory that would have to be scrapped, or a lot of work would be needed to turn it around. And they then started speculating on real estate. So these are people with no real estate experience who borrowed insane amounts of capital from Chinese banks or the shadow banking system. And the banks are playing around in that too, because the banks take depositor money and then they gamble in shadow banking for higher returns. And this is often sold to the depositors, these wealth management products, as a safe way to earn a little bit higher return than a checking account or a savings account. But the president of the Bank of China, in an op-ed, called these wealth management products, and there's trillions of these in China's shadow banking system, Ponzi schemes, because these things in reality are on very bad construction projects, very bad housing developments and construction projects that have worse collateral than junk bonds or leveraged loans.
Right.
So the residential or commercial buildings or properties or entire housing developments will either not be finished, not started at all, or in complete states of disrepair. And not all of them are like that, but a lot of them are like that. I forgot to mention the book name. It's available on Audible audiobook. It's about 7 or 8 hours long. It's China's Great Wall of Debt, about shadow banking and ghost cities.
Okay.
By Denny McMahon. So your listeners can go out and get that book. That was written a couple years ago. It's a must read. I think it's probably finish it pretty quickly.